Welcome to Here Comes the Boom, your go-to for all Kentucky basketball and Kentucky basketball recruiting news, brought to you by KSR and KSR Plus. We've got an exciting show for you today, something a little different. We're going to be talking about Kentucky's basketball's 2024-25 season with a special guest. We're going to bring him on soon. Before we do that, let's chat a second about our good friend Andy Ludicky and My Perfect Franchise. Are you a displaced corporate executive or wanting to put your career in your own hands? Or are you an experienced entrepreneur wanting to diversify? Well, Andy Ludicky and MyPerfectFranchise.net can help. Andy is a huge college sports fan and franchise veteran, having owned multiple franchises and businesses. Using his expertise, he helps others find their American dream through a very thorough consultation and evaluation process. Call Andy, put your life and career in your own hands. Best of all, his services are 100% free to you. So what do you have to lose? Find your perfect franchise at myperfectfranchise.net. Welcome back. We're now joined by Evan Miyakawa. He runs evanmiya.com. Sorry, I'm getting the pronunciation right. A great source for college basketball analytics. And we're going to talk some Kentucky basketball with him. Evan, thanks for joining the show.
Glad to be here. This is as good a time as any to be talking Kentucky, talking SEC. We're practically to the time of the year when basketball's on the front of everyone's mind. So, might as well dig into it.
So before we get into some specifics, I know you put out a report about teams struggling with roster turnover. I just want to get your overall thoughts on this year's Kentucky team. What have you thought so far?
I think the thing I've been so impressed with Kentucky is given the challenges that they have to face with an entirely new roster and a new coaching staff, I think people might have expected them to be a tournament team and be kind of playing their best basketball by the end of the season. I don't think anyone thought that they would be a top 10 team this early in the season with marquee wins over teams like Duke and Gonzaga. So I've just been extremely impressed by the job that not only the players have done, but the coaching staff has done to get all these pieces playing so well so early together. And if this is how good they've been, barely a month and a half into the season, like how much better are they going to get, by March, right? So I've just been extremely impressed. And I think the fact that they have so many different contributing pieces, that they don't overly rely on one player, that on any given night it can be someone different, I think that serves them well as they're still figuring things out, and that they don't have to overly rely on one way of play. And so I've just been really impressed from top to bottom, and I think this is certainly way better than even the most optimistic Kentucky fans could have thought, and the season's looking really, really great for them so far.
And what's most top of mind right now is that report you put out about teams with roster turnover struggling this season. Based on your report, why is that, and why do you think Kentucky may be such an outlier right now?
Right. So I did a study earlier this offseason. I just kind of provided an update over on my blog yesterday, which basically looks at, in the modern transfer portal era where you can get recruits from seemingly anywhere. You can get them from the high school ranks. You can re-recruit your own guys. That's kind of the phrase that's used now. You can get guys through the transfer portal. Like what is the most reliable way for a high major team with, championship or Final Four aspirations to build? And basically what I found is, looking over the last 3 years where this has been more common with the transfer portal, is that the teams that have been the most successful have been the ones that, yes, getting talent matters and you should chase talent over all else. But looking at teams that are talented, the ones that have been the most successful have been the ones that have retained most of their returning players and have at least half or a majority of their minutes coming from returners, and then they add one or two key pieces to raise that talent level through the transfer portal, through the freshman ranks, etc. That's what we saw with UConn last year. They had a big returning core, and then they added a couple key pieces, and that's why they were so good. And so looking at this year, what I found through just a little bit into the season is that if you look at the high major teams like Kentucky, who have flipped their entire roster, or at least most of their roster, I think there's 12 or 14 high major teams that fall in this category. Kentucky and only one or two others have actually exceeded expectations so far this season based on the roster talent that they have. So given just the pure sum of your talent, how good is your team supposed to be? Kentucky has obviously done way better than that, but a lot of other teams are struggling to meet expectations. This has been the theme for most of these teams in this camp, that they have really struggled with all of the roster turnover to kind of meet the level that people have expected based on the talent they've amassed. And so then when you look at how Kentucky, on the other hand, has thrived early with the amount of talent turnover that they've had, it is only more impressive, the job that they've done. And they're certainly an outlier compared to all of these other teams who have struggled to kind of meet expectations based on the roster they've put together when they have so many new faces.
So going off of that, I'm sure you factored in a lot of this roster attrition when putting together your preseason models. So how has Kentucky performed relative to where you had them in the preseason?
Right. So based on roster talent only, I would have had Kentucky as a top 15 team in the preseason, just because they did get a lot of really good pieces. But the way that my statistical model works for building a team preseason projection is for teams with the same coach or who have sort of been in the same system for multiple years. Certainly your success in previous seasons also does play a part in determining what your outlook is for a given season. But for a team like Kentucky, as well as many others who have a new coaching staff, it's mostly just based on your roster talent that you have coming in. And then there's just sort of a baked in understanding that when you have a new coach and a new roster, that you're not going to be probably quite as good as where you could be, say, in year 2 or year 3. And so Kentucky's preseason ranking on my site was, I think, in the low 20s, like 21 or 22. And so certainly still a top 25 team coming into the year, but there's a much higher ceiling as much as a much lower floor. There's a range of outcomes that could happen for a team with a new coach and an entirely new roster. And so Kentucky being a consensus top 10 team early in the season with marquee wins that they've had, they've certainly far exceeded expectations based on where my model had them.
So what would you say are maybe 1 or 2 analytics in which Kentucky stands out this year?
Yeah, I think number one, I think they're really balanced. I mentioned this before, but they don't have any one player that they have to rely on. And I think their depth is really impressive, and I think that's going to really help in SEC play. I mean, we saw that in their win against Gonzaga. Both point guards went down, and they're still able to beat what I consider to be a top 5 team in the country still in Gonzaga, basically in a road environment. And I think the thing that's really impressive as well, from if you're digging more into the rotations that they have, is Kentucky's starting lineup of Lamont Butler, Otega Owe, Jackson Robinson, Andrew Carr, and Amari Williams has been analytically one of the best starting lineups in the entire country. I have them 6th amongst all starting lineups in the country in terms of predicted lineup efficiency. So basically, how good is this lineup supposed to be going forward? And part of that's because it's really solid offensively and defensively. There's 5 different players in that lineup who can all score. So it's a very capable scoring lineup. And then when you factor in that all of these players have had a lot of experience, that's the 3rd best lineup in the country in terms of experience that lineup has based on games played. All of those factors lead to it's just really hard to beat this lineup. That's what we've seen so far. That group of 5 has been really successful in a lot of their biggest games. And so that's certainly something that stands out to me from the analytics side for this team.
And then on the flip side, what do you see as maybe some areas of concern for this Kentucky team with SEC play approaching?
Yeah, I do think kind of looking outside of that starting 5, maybe the other pieces that they've had, your Kirk Creases, your Brandon Garrisons, for example, it's been a little bit more of a struggle to get them to perform on a consistent level. And something that I track on my website is, for each individual player, how well is the team performing when they're on the court? And when you just purely look at it in that sense, based on how much more is Kentucky outscoring opponents based on each player being on the court, adjusting for opponent strength that each player's faced to kind of be a bit fair based on who you've played, Lamont Butler, Amari Williams, and Andrew Carr are basically way above everyone else on the team in terms of how well Kentucky has performed. And then after that, there's a bit of a drop. And so I think especially when you get to bench pieces like Brandon Garrison, for example, if you look at how well Kentucky has played when Garrison has been on the court versus on the bench, the team has been a lot worse when he's been on the floor. And that's certainly an area for improvement. I think based on what I looked at last, the team was about 24 points per 100 possessions worse when Brandon Garrison is on the floor compared to on the bench. I don't think that number is going to stay the same the whole course of the season. I think he's better than that, but that's certainly something that you want to fix if you want to get reliable performance out of your pieces, basically outside of that starting lineup.
And then the last thing I want to ask about from more of a general perspective is we're hearing so much about the SEC this season. So what stands out to you just overall about the strength of the conference this year?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a central topic in the college basketball media landscape. Just, is this the best conference that we've ever seen in basketball? Every single night, it seems like the SEC only raises its status based on how it's playing other teams in the non-conference. It's been absolutely ridiculous. I mean, for some context here, on my website, which again predicts how good teams are going to be going forward, I have 7 SEC teams in the top 12. So Auburn at 1, Tennessee at 3, Alabama 7, Florida 8, Kentucky 9, Ole Miss 11, Mississippi State 12. 7 teams in the top 12. That's like college football level, power rankings that we're often used to seeing here. Not for basketball. And then even the bottom of the conference is still really good. South Carolina, which just had a big win this week, they're the worst team in the conference. They're 65th in the country. Any team inside the top 70 is a team that, if they get hot in conference play, would be good enough to make the tournament. So it's kind of a shame that some of these teams are purely just not going to make it because of how good this conference is. But on the flip side, there's been a lot of talk about how the SEC is in line to potentially get 12 bids to the tournament, which would be a record. I certainly think they can do it. I think statistically it lines up. And so it's good and bad. That means you're not going to have any bad losses in conference play. But on the flip side, there's no off nights. Every single road game is going to be a battle. And so, if you're a Kentucky fan, don't be discouraged if you go on the road and lose to Georgia or Missouri, because a lot of good teams in this conference, that's going to happen. That's just how loaded this conference is.
Well, Evan, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we let you go, where can people find your work?
Sure. EvanMiya.com is where you can find pretty much everything. All the data stuff is there. Player ratings, team ratings, lineup metrics, game predictions. I've also got links to all of my social media platforms on there. I do a lot of stuff on Twitter, as well as some video stuff on other platforms, so you can check me out there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Evan. We'll be following along.
Appreciate it, guys. Thank you.